I've had the singular and sacred privilege, because of a career in ministry and in counseling, to be with people in those moments which one therapist calls the alarm moments of their lives. Been able to sit in living rooms, hospital rooms, counseling offices, and listen. Years ago, a long way from here, in a living room late at night, a husband and father raged around the house, shouting and screaming. The wife huddled in the corner. 1,000 shards from a beautiful broken mirror glittered up out of the carpet as evidence of a marriage that was shattering into pieces. Life was falling apart. The counseling room, where she and he came and sat. The marriage felt in trouble, but this day was the first time she would say to him, "I'm done. There's someone else I'm in love." He catapulted out of the chair and burst out of the office. I thought he would be violent, break something. A few moments later, he strode back in, filled with rage, tears spouting. "The children, what are you thinking?" Sat there and watched life, marriage, family fall apart, not to be restored. Pulled up a chair by a hospital bed. Had I not followed her over the last 2 years, I wouldn't have known her. From a robust, healthy, reasonably young woman filled with life and joy and beauty, her face was now gaunt, her eyes somewhat vacant. She'd gone hand to hand, mano a mano, with this enemy called cancer. It was clear today that the battle was lost. While she didn't utter the words, they hovered in the air. "God, where are you?" Life is falling apart. Could be that you've come into worship this morning in a space like that. Whether it's physically your own life, a relationship, a future, a family, falling apart. If that happens to be where you are, I want to ask you to listen to a song. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing. Because I don't know the melody, I don't know the tune. I do know the lyrics. They're found in Psalm 102. It's a unique psalm because many of the psalms include some kind of notice about what's going to happen or who it is. Some of the psalms will say this was written by David or by Moses or by the sons of Korah or the school to which the psalmic writer belonged. Others will have instructions. This is for music. This is for worship. Here are the musical, the literary terms. Others will even say, this was the circumstance that occasioned this psalm. When David fled into the cave, when David committed adultery with Bathsheba. Many times the Psalms will give us that kind of information. This psalm includes none of that. It does have something, but none of that. It causes many scholars to say this psalm was intended for general use. Not just for worship, yes, for worship, but for more than that. Not just for Sabbath morning in worship, but for Wednesday evening in the living room, or Thursday noon in the hospital room, or Monday afternoon on the counseling couch. This was intended for life, but a certain moment in life. So here's what it does have. I'm going to call it the title. I don't know what else to call it. It's what it says just above the stanzas of the song. It says, a prayer of one whose life is falling to pieces and who lets God know just how bad it is. That's what this song is for. So if it feels like life is falling apart, listen to the 4 stanzas. They are of unequal length, but of equal power. I've named each one word name. The first stanza I've called plea. Plea. Pastor Tim read it a moment ago. God, listen to my prayer. Listen to the pain in my cries. Don't turn your back on me just when I need you so desperately. Pay attention. This is a cry for help. And hurry, this can't wait. There's insistence. There's intensity. There's urgency. Hear me. Don't you dare turn your back on me. Listen to what I'm saying and answer me now. Wow. I don't have the chutzpah to talk to God that way. So I'll use the psalmist's words to talk to God that way. Because I've had those moments, and if you're honest, you have too. And this morning may be one of those times. So what's going on in the psalmist's life? It will become clear as we read the psalm that two things are happening. One is that he's physically sick. His body is being profoundly affected by whatever illness this is that he's fighting. Two is that his beloved city of Jerusalem has been destroyed. The Babylonians have ridden in, razed the city, and left nothing but ruins. And for both of those, the uniqueness and the personal specificity of his own life and the grand reality of the life of his people. And he's pleading, God, hear me. Don't turn your back on me. Answer me. First stanza. Second stanza, protest. Protest, God, this is what I'm going through. I want you to understand what I'm experiencing. It's graphic and it's real. It's poetic, but you can picture it. Second stanza, I'm wasting away to nothing. I'm burning up with fever. I'm a ghost of my former self, half consumed already by terminal illness. My jaws ache from gritting my teeth. I'm nothing but skin and bones. I'm like a buzzard in the desert, a crow perched on the rubble. Insomniac, I twitter away, mournful as a sparrow in the gutter. All day long my enemies taunt me, while others just curse. They bring in meals, casseroles of ashes. I draw drink from a barrel of my tears, and all because of your furious anger. You swept me up and threw me out. There's nothing left of me, a withered weed swept clean from the path. How could you get more graphic? How could this person be more clear about what he's experiencing? I'm nothing like I used to be. I'm skin and bones. I'm emaciated. God, don't you see me? And on top of it, my enemies, those who've destroyed my city, they're laughing, celebrating, taunting. God, it feels like you have swept me up and thrown me out. Listen to the words of Christopher Ashe as he captures the key essence of what the psalmist is saying. Verses 1 and 2 cry with urgent call from deep distress. That's the first stanza. That's plea. Verses 3 to 11 tell us the distress. That's the second stanza. So now that intense plea at the beginning, now he's going to explain what that was all about. The dominant motif is transience. Transience. Tempus fugit. A Latin phrase that means time flies. Transience. Time flies. In his distress, he feels all the dimensions of the misery of a fading life, of mortality, the images of smoke, glowing, that is fading embers, grass, and evening shadow convey vividly the desperation of not being able to have any lasting being. Smoke blows away, embers go cold, grass withers, the evening shadow merges into night. It is lonely, restless, miserably shameful, taunted, and grievous. It's transient. The sands in the hourglass of my life, says the psalmist, are running out. The embers are dying out. The shadows are lengthening. Time flies. You may not feel that physically today, but you felt it somewhere. A relationship, a friendship, a job, a future, a beloved place. Time flies. Transience. We know it from our youngest years, don't we? Read a story just this week from Newport Beach. A woman named Nancy Walker wrote about her 5-year-old neighbor, little Jimmy Jurgen. Jimmy Jurgen had a goldfish he loved, at least for a little while. Goldfish died. Jimmy invited her to come to the funeral. He was going to bury the goldfish. So she went to the funeral. He had a piece of cardboard. He wanted her to write on it. He couldn't write yet. Would you please write on this? She said, I will. What do you want me to write? Write his name. What's his name? Moberg. Okay, Moberg's his name. Okay, she wrote Moberg. What else would you like me to write? Jimmy thought about it for a minute, and then he said, write, he was fun while he lasted. I mean, just a child. But he gets that sense that time flies. Life is transient. That's the psalmist. That's the first protest against what's happening to him physically in his body. But there's a second cause, and that's his city. Now, I want to dip into the next stanza, just a couple of lines, to get a sense of what's happening with that. So down to verses 13 and 14, you'll get up and help from your throne and help Zion. It's time for compassionate help. Oh, how your servants love this city's rubble and weep with compassion over its dust. Really? They love the rubble? They weep over the dust? I don't get it. I don't understand. I know someone who does understand and who helped me understand. Her name is Edel Amundsen. I talked with Edel just this last week. Asked her, may I share your story, Edel? She said, you may. Happened about 4 decades ago here in this community. Edel, a nurse up at the medical center, her husband Bill, a chaplain in the medical center, both deeply and greatly loved. This was just before I joined the chaplain's department, a few months. They were having fun with another couple, time off, out in nature, and right in front of her, her husband was killed. Gruesome. Horrible. The grief was crushing, unbearable. Edel said, I just was so overcome, so overwhelmed. How does one survive this? Speaking of the transience of life, speaking of life falling apart, the days merged into weeks. She said, I realized a few weeks in, I needed to do something. I needed to go back to the southeastern part of this country, back to where Bill and I had met, where we had fallen in love, dated, where we had gotten engaged, got married, where he spent the first years of his ministry. I needed to go back. I needed to go back and try to find some kind of closure. So I traveled back. A beautiful couple we had known gave me a home, gave me a car. We're at your disposal. Do what you need to do. One of the first places, Edel said, I had to visit was where Bill lived when he had pastored and we had fallen in love and gotten engaged. So that's one of the first places I drove. It was out in the country. She said, I had decided I'm going to drive out there and I'm not going to look at the house. I'm not going to look at it until I stop and park and get out of the car and come around, and I'm going to take it all in at one time. She said, I sat there when I knew I was there by looking over here. I knew I was at the place. I sat there and tried to gather myself. I was shocked at how deep and intense were the emotions. Got out of the car, walked around, and took it in all at once. And it was burned to the ground. Just burned. She said there was still smoke rising. There were still embers glowing. She said, I collapsed on the road. I said, how cruel is this? Even this is gone? I sat there overcome, she said. Is this all that's left? So I was listening to her story again this week. I found myself thinking what I had thought when I first listened to it decades ago. She'd had that house, maybe. That would have allowed some more processing of emotion, some greater closure. But that's gone. And then I think of these words, oh, how your servants love this city's rubble and weep with compassion over its dust. Edel understands those. In fact, from the SD Bible commentary, the exiles even enjoy contemplating the piled up stones and dust of what was once their glorious city, Jerusalem. So deeply in love with Zion are they. There's a pathetic touch of nostalgia in the concept of this verse. Even the ruins of our childhood home are dear to us. Protest. That's the second stanza. Plea. Listen to me. Protest. This is what is happening in my life. Third stanza. Providence. Providence. Now, something needs to be in place before we read the third stanza, because it will help us get a sense of what's happening in the psalmist's mind and life. There's a turn that's about to take place in verse 12. The late James Montgomery Boyce, pastor and theologian, helps us understand it. He says, verse 12, that's the first verse we'll read. Verse 12 is the turning point of the psalm. So much so that Martin Luther said, everything that has gone before looks to this verse. Boyce continues, everything that follows builds on it also. In the previous verses, the psalmist has described his frail and wasting condition. He is like smoke that vanishes. But he has a God who is not at all like that. He is the eternal, immutable God, and it is this God whom he is trusting. Now the stanza. Yet you, God, that's verse 12. Yet you, God, are sovereign still, always and ever sovereign. You'll get up from your throne and help Zion. It's time for compassionate help. Oh, how your servants love this city's rubble and weep with compassion over its dust. The godless nations will sit up and take notice, see your glory, worship your name. When God rebuilds Zion, when he shows up in all his glory, when he attends to the prayers of the wretched, he won't dismiss their prayers. Write this down for the next generation, so people not yet born will praise God. God looked down from his high holy place. From heaven he surveyed the earth. He listened to the groans of the doomed. He opened the doors of their death cells. Write it so the story can be told in Zion, so God's praise will be sung in Jerusalem's streets and wherever people gather together along with their rulers to worship him. The psalm turns when he says, but you, God, yet you, God, are sovereign still. Understand, he's talking first about transience, the transience of human life. Time flies. The transience even of our most stable institutions. Time flies. But now he turns to God and he says, God, stable, solid, eternal, immutable, sovereign. And he places those two beside each other. It's not a specific answer to his illness. It's a long-term answer to the destruction of his city. But it's the concept that he wants his reader to grasp. God is sovereign. God is solid. He's the firm ground beneath your feet. And there are times when that alone makes all the difference. I was taking clinical pastoral education, CPE, up at the medical center back when my beard wasn't gray. We'd taken a day off, the group, to go down to San Diego to go whale watching. I'd never been whale watching. Truth is, I hadn't been on the sea much at all, certainly not in some of the smaller boats. I was unprepared for the rocking and the rolling and the bobbing, and I'm telling you, we hadn't even gotten out of the harbor when I started refunding, man. I mean, I fully, completely, totally shameful. People watching, I didn't care. I would fed more fishes than I saw. Over the side, throughout the morning, it was an awful. I heard about whales somewhere, but all I was thinking was what I was going through. It was a terrible day. We got back finally to the harbor, to the port. And I got out of that boat. I cannot adequately describe, I wouldn't have believed it if I had not experienced it. I got out of that boat and I was suddenly fine. I felt fine. And I was hungry. I didn't have anything on my stomach. So I'm like, let's go get Mexican food. I'm happy. And the others are looking at me like, food? After what we just had to witness, you're thinking about food? We have no interest in food. It was my first realization, because had you and I stood there talking that day, you could have looked over my shoulder and you would have still seen the ocean, and it was bobbing, waves up and down, boats bobbing, probably people doing things over the side. It was all the same, except I now stood on a firm foundation. And it changed everything for me. It didn't change the sea. It didn't change the waves. It would not change the storm. But it gave me peace. A psalmist whose body is racked with illness wants us to write that down. He says, write this down for future generations. Write it down so that they will know, they will look back, and they will know at the most devastating times of our personal lives and our corporate history, when everything was falling apart, we stood on an immutable God. A God who will not shift or shake or rattle or roll. G. Campbell Morgan, yesteryear's preacher. There's nothing more calculated to strengthen the heart in suffering or inspire the spirit with courage in days of danger and difficulty than the sense of the eternity of God. Providence. And the fourth stanza. Promise. Promise. The last few verses, God sovereignly brought me to my knees. He cut me down in my prime. Oh, don't, I prayed. Please don't let me die. You have more years than you know what to do with. You laid the earth's foundations a long time ago and handcrafted the very heavens. You'll still be around when they're long gone, threadbare and discarded like an old suit of clothes. You'll throw them away like a worn-out coat. But year after year, you're as good as new. Your servants' children will have a good place to live, and their children will be at home with you. In other words, he once again comes back to this sense of transient of the human experience and the transcendence of the divine experience. He lays them side by side and says, because of that, even though our lives can be like an old pair of jeans thrown out, you remain. And because you remain, we have hope. We have a tomorrow. We have a future. We will have children. And they will know our story because we've written it down for them to carry. Promise. So she sat there crumpled in a heap on that dirt road, through bleary eyes, washed with tears, looking at the ashes and the smoke. It's all gone. But Ethel said to me, it was while I was sitting there, Just taking it in. That there was this slow dawning realization that it wasn't all gone, because I realized that the chimney still stood. That old rock chimney had survived the fire. And it stood tall and firm. She said, through the crushing reality of my grief, somehow I latched onto that chimney. And it became for me an image that while much was gone and much would forever be different, something remained. Something of me, and even something of him, she said. And mostly something of God. She said it would take me a long time, years, wondering, grieving, indifferent to God. She said, I was never truly angry, but I just had no use. But I kept coming back to that chimney. And then I read in Isaiah one day that he would turn ashes to beauty. Ashes to beauty. And Ethel said to me, I claimed that. And I can tell you all these years later, God has done exactly that. So friends, I don't know what you brought in this morning. I don't know where life is falling apart for you. I don't know how long it will last, and I have no easy answers. But I can tell you this. It's been written down. People whose lives have fallen apart have told the story. And they've said, in the midst of our transience, there's a transcendent God, a firm foundation. So when he has that chimney appear out of the ashes of your life, I can tell you this much. It won't be based on something that passes. It will be based on the transcendent, immutable, sovereign God of love and compassion.